Reflective Podcast.
Blessings and welcome back to another episode of the Fully Reflective Podcast, here with Shifu teacher, embodiment mirror, Will Duprey. And this conversation is a long time coming, really because of a quick thing you said one time, which is you should check out a show called Severance. I think you'd like it. And I remember I went shortly thereafter to watch the trailer, and my mind was blown as to how direct of a correlation the concept of the show had to so much of what you and I talk about, or at least my relationship to meeting you and knowing you, which is through Raja Yoga. And, why is Raja Yoga why is that even a thing? Why is that even a relevant tool in the universe? Well, there's some degree of severance that's occurred, and some type of sewing needs to happen. Some suturing needs to happen to unsever what has been severed. So yeah, welcome back to this container to discuss and talk.
Appreciate it. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. Where are you in the world again?
In Malaysia, still kicking in the jungle. Not really. And people think that, but it's as modern of a city as any other city.
Right.
But at the same time, yeah, you do have easy access to walking in streams through the jungle. So that is pretty nice as well.
Very nice.
But yeah, on this side of the world.
Nice. Beautiful. Well, I see such like a wide stream through the forest of this potential conversation, and I suppose I just go right to the heart of what felt like for me, my just most sincere sense of curiosity to like, because we could have just talked about it through text, but like, I was like, oh, this would be a great podcast.
Sure.
But yeah, like when I saw the trailer per your recommendation, I was like, whoa, then watch the show with Belle. And I'm like, wow, this is an example of an art piece that whether or not the person who wrote it has metaphysical understanding or blah, 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 someone has told a story that's about a fictional kind of, pretty sci-fi topic, idea, concept. And yet it's the most perfect reflection and story form of what happens metaphysically when the soul self stuff forgets itself as the severed mythological entity formerly known as the ego. And there are two different lives. For those listening not familiar with the show Severance, it's about a dude who goes to work at this company, and no spoiler alerts, but if you want to work at this job position, you take this elevator and it goes down to this floor, and there's some type of technology that literally, because there's a brain implant, it cuts off your memory from who you are in the outside world. So when you're at work, you have no memory of who you are in your regular life. But when you're at your regular life, you have no memory of what your work even is. And I just feel like that's such an interesting conversation for, well, the utility of Raja Yoga.
Yeah, I think also looking at like pragmatically, like how, in some ways, like, oh, that's great, sign me up for it, right? Like traditional concepts of work, like if we look at work and life and work-life balance. And also I think it's important to put in perspective, like when this came out, it was like early 2022. So we're still pretty heavily worldwide dealing with COVID restrictions. Obviously there's a lot of change that we saw during that time in general. And when we look at like news, like no matter what the source is, like the information is often very polarizing, it's on one side or the other. So I'm sure like, if you were giving out the ability to, do severance during the height of these times, like I'm sure people would sign up for it, right? It's like go to work and then you don't know what's going on in the world. It's quite interesting. You
Right.
leave work and you have no idea what you're doing in work. But
Right.
ultimately, like to some degree, we see these characters sort of like develop a yearning for this other aspect of their life, right? Like there's like a yearning for it. Like they want to know, like, I mean, this is completely fictitious. I'm like, elaborating on it, but they want to know who this person is that's doing this work. Like, what is this work that they're doing? And what is this life that they're living outside of this work? So I believe that they, as you get into the show, they even sort of hint at the sort of daydreaming analogies of who they are outside of work and inside of work.
Right.
It's quite fascinating in that way. But yeah, just thinking at it on a pragmatic level, I mean, the polarizing effect of who we are at work and what we do, and I think that's like that's sort of broken down a lot more, especially like fast forward in the last 2 years. Like we've seen a lot of a push towards work-life balance, or a pushing towards like what you do in the world is as important as how you live in the world. And we also want to see like companies be responsible and not just like, rainbow wash or BLM at the right moments, but we want to see that as part of their ethos, like as an organization having like a good, and if we tie that into Raja Yoga, I think that's ultimately like there are individuals who want to know sort of the depth of themselves, like how far that goes. It's like not who you just are in this particular moment, having a conversation where we can talk. And, maybe this is part of like what you do, which I guess we could consider that work. Like work doesn't always equate to what we're paid for, right? Ideally, it lines up with our purpose and what we're doing in the world.
Yeah.
But we could use it in a way where it kind of pushes us beyond this thing that we do, right? So
Right.
yeah, it's fascinating. There's a lot to unpack. There's a lot of like pieces here, which is probably why we didn't text about it, because we'd probably still be texting about it now for the next 3 years or something like that. But
Yeah. Well, okay, that's a cool insert, because I think you have something I've noticed and experienced personally that I feel you do well is simplify concepts that could get heady by just making it very, as you said, pragmatic, right? I like the word utility, like utility based. Like no one's confused about what to do with the shoe. Like it's the design and like you put it on your foot is done. It's no more.
Sure.
So the show is entertainment, right? So cool story, well done. It's just art. Inspires someone, maybe, I don't know, possibly. Introspective, kind of as like an introspective inspiration, maybe. But in terms of the like utility of these, Raja Yoga concepts, how would you if you are called to bridge it to like the complex to the simple, but the utility's there. But in terms of like Raja Yoga, the idea that the Atma gets severed or into samsara, there is the forgetting, the terms that are in Sanskrit that are not in English. Like I met you, I learned about the word dharma. I learned about the Purusha Arthas. I learned the word
Right.
Jiva Atma. Like these terms changed my life, that really simplified things that were complicated. That just the other day, I said some Raja Yoga terms to somebody and they were like, well, I'd rather not get heady. And I was just like, fascinating how that makes you feel like it's getting heady. But for me, Dharma, Jiva Mukti and Samsara and Moksha, like, oh man, it's the opposite of heady for me. These are terms that have simplified the heady stuff into utility, into very pragmatic. So when you see, here's the actual baton. When you see this show, what goes through the Will Dupree conduit of, wow, this implies that, and this show as a fictitious piece of content in the world connects to and correlates with these things that are pretty advanced Raja Yoga techniques.
Yeah, I guess on like your viewpoint, I see less of the yogic framework when I'm looking at the show. I mean, I can identify with what you're saying, but I think I look at it more in maybe in my psychology hat or something, like in that regards. But the thing that really talks to me, like sort of as an artist or what have you, is like is what I mentioned earlier, is like the yearning, like these individuals, like having severed their work life existences, still have this element of like longing, right? Or like even like kind of like the loneliness, right? As they are, they're like trying to find this other thing. And to me, that's very relevant to human existence, even without the severance, right? Is like there is often like a longing that an individual feels. And sometimes we elaborate on that. We think it's like, we look at it as like nostalgia. Like even the word nostalgia is like remembering something with like a deal with some semblance of pain.
Right. Like it's
So
gone.
like,
It hurts kind of.
yeah, exactly, precisely. So like I think that, when we tie that into something like, spirituality, one of the issues that I see often is that we sometimes don't take the methodology sometimes doesn't take into the account that the individual is already the solution for the thing in which they're searching for, right? Because ultimately, like you can't experience something, someone can't experience something for you. Like the growth actually has to happen to the individual going through the experience, regardless of the modality. So even if I set aside all modalities, and yeah, we're choosing like this idea of Raja Yoga, which often people think is more like mental exercises and thinking, high thoughts, and that can be a part of it for sure. But just to reiterate, what I think that you're talking about is the aspect which is sort of drawn out through some of the teachings that you and I have shared together, which is the idea that we utilize the physical mastery, and this is not to say physical performance, but physical mastery of energy in order to tap into the mental aspect of it. And one of the reasons why is because the brain, when it's in the right condition, doesn't use its energy to access knowledge to the senses. And then when it pulls back from using the senses, it has a clarity. Now that clarity is very interesting because we can call that concentration or something deeper, usually like a meditative state or even samadhi or what have you. And we learn things within those places. Even deep concentration, we might be sitting in a meditative practice but not actually meditating, and we get all kinds of downloads, we get all kinds of information, all this sort of peripheral energy comes out of the mind, and we learn to like understand that in certain situations you have limited capacity in life, so you make amends with yourself, sometimes mentally, sometimes you physically pick up the phone and have to make those amends as well. But it starts to clear all the channels out, part of the channels being the mind, other parts of the channels being the body, other channels being energetic ones, which we call nadis, and people often talk about chakras. You get what I'm saying in that sense.
Yeah.
So we've come to this level of physical understanding and mastery of the energy in our system. And now we're sort of moving into the higher aspect of our system, which we associate with the mind. Does it mean that it has to necessarily be the brain? I'm not so certain it does. I'm not certain that Raja Yoga is about the brain. And that's where we kind of get into scientific differences, like about the brain and the rest of the body. But even now you see science catching up and saying, hey, you have as many neural pathways in your abdomen as you do your brain. Right. So we're finding that the body has energy, and that leads to essentially this mind state, which, Patanjali talks about and everyone else talks about. And we sometimes look at that state as being mindfulness. Yogis tend to look at it as being beyond mindfulness. So it actually goes further than mindfulness into different levels and states of samadhi, which again have their attachments and what have you. But to go, to sort of tone all that stuff down and get back into this idea of Raja Yoga, I think it still has to deal with an individual longing. Like they see this other aspect of themselves. And like it's through the tool, which sometimes could be yoga or other things, that those images of that life or of that aspect of yourself is sort of reflected back to you, right? And this does trickle down into mainstream, from like positive affirmations to meditating in the morning to, you know, thinking things in a positive way. And science is also showing that, you know, these things do work to a degree, right? That actually, when we get to, actually, this is really cool. This is a sort of a different topic, but it ties in. I was reading how that positive affirmations work very well, especially when you don't feel so positive about yourself, right? But after you actually start to feel this good quality, you know, you feel good about who you are and your capabilities, and you've harnessed the things that you're trying to do, then they're no longer as effective as they are, right? So it's interesting because we often don't look at yoga or spirituality that way. We tend to like look at it as, I'm going to keep doing this thing and doing this thing and doing this thing and doing this thing, whatever it might be. Keep doing asanas, keep doing pranayama, keep doing meditation, keep doing kriyas, keep doing bandhas, whatever it may be. Keep thinking high thoughts. But at some point you reach a state, and in the state, those tools are no longer necessary. So it's interesting. So to me, that study is actually really cool, because it validates the effect of the technique, in this case positive affirmation, you know, speaking to yourself like in a mirror or reflectively or whatever, to raise yourself to that state. But once you're in that state, the tool is no longer effective,
right?
So you only need it to remember it in case you're no longer in that state again, right? So essentially, like, there's a lot of joy in that as a practitioner, as you know, I'm sure, in that that's when you usually get to just really enjoy the practice or sadhana just for the joy of it. Like, you just do it for fun, because it's not taking you any further, potentially. It's not slowing you down, but, you know, there are other effects, obviously, when we look at yoga specifically, because you're often using your body. So it's still having a beneficial effect on, you know, your, you know, gray matter in your brain, to like your physiological conditions, from bone density to circulatory system to endocrine system, right?
Right.
Yeah.
I'm so hung up on the word longing and all that it feels like, just for the art aspect of, well, so it's like you kind of like reframed it for me and like painted the picture of these characters in this world. So, but first the person has to sign up for Severance in the show, right?
Yeah.
So the first person has to feel a sense of something's missing, which, you know, me and the whole word FOMO and missing out on nothing and all this.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
First, someone feels something's missing. So they want to sign up for a job that's so intense that you can't even remember who you are once you do the job. So something's got to be, you got to have a certain kind of longing to even want to do a kind of job like that, to sign up, you know? So you sign up. Then when you're there, you have the longing to know who you were before you made the choice. And a new longing is birth because you adhered to a choice that came from the first longing. And then the second you longs to know the first you, that at some point, I remember one of the greatest gifts that it's amazing. It's like, you are in my life, and this other guy named Steven Anderson, I'd say, are two primary mentors. And one day I saw him after years of not seeing him, and he just had his hands on my shoulder, and we just breathed. And he has actually background in Shambhala meditation and stuff. And then after just like a moment of beauty, I mean, I don't 5-10 seconds, I don't know how long, he just smiled, and there's like just the eyes did the shine thing, and then he's like, "You look integrated." And it just brought up so much for me, because I was like, whoa, that's maybe the best thing that I could possibly hear from somebody who could probably notice whether I'm in a really actually good state or potentially not the best, and has seen me in the full spectrum. And I look at that Severance metaphor, it's like a show that is, for me at least, maybe personally, just a powerful mirror for not just the quote unquote spiritual journey, I feel like I've said it several times in the past few months, like the word spiritual is kind of nonsense. And the more I get into it, it's like enough with this word spiritual. It's relevant for the one who hasn't touched it. But once you touch it and access it and know it, there's nothing that isn't that. So it's like saying, wow, that bicycle is very bipedal. Well, yeah, all bicycles are bipedal. That's what it implies. Of course it is.
Sure.
And the word spiritual like that, I don't know, sometimes it rings like that for me. But the first self and the second self's longing, those longings eventually come to a meeting point. And then everything you just said about Raja Yoga and these tools and like, yeah, as part of my testimony too, is just like, man, I remember before I was doing these practices and before I had a sadhana, did a super intense period of like devotion and like intensity. I'd say it probably 3 or 4 years of like more intense. And then since this 4th year, 5th year kind of moment of like, wow, I feel like I've accessed the thing that I was once longing for. And if I keep that longing going, I'll actually leave the thing that I longed for. So now the longing has been replaced with the enjoyment of the thing that was longed for. And I don't really remember how. I think they're at the end of the season. It kind of implied like there might be another season of Severance coming because, yeah, no spoiler alerts, but
Right.
it did seem to be a discovery of sorts. I'll say that. But
Yeah.
I mean, that's such a calling of mine to look at bridge moments and art that has such a mundane access to everybody in the whole mundanity of existence, that then a little, watching something on Netflix and then bing, could just send anybody into a moment of recognition of something that's super important. No meditation practice or nothing, just clicking a button. But then this piece of art could speak to something in me that I needed to need somebody to speak to, and I didn't even know it. And now I spoke to it, and now I awoke to something. So that was why, you were like, check out Severance. And then it's funny for me that sometimes you're like, yeah, I maybe wouldn't see it like that. And maybe that's not the yogic lens in me. Maybe that's more the shamanic lens in me, because I like looking at how the normal states of identity get kind of tricked into going into the mythic realms and into the shamanic realms. And sometimes people or we step on puddles that aren't puddles, but they're abysses, and we sink down into this quick moment of our life that turns into a corkscrew into something we didn't know was coming, which again is kind of what Severance is. It's this mundanity. It's this dude's he's in super FOMO. He feels like, what's the point? And then he chooses the thing that causes a deeper dissatisfaction to some degree, but it actually just showed him how dissatisfied he already was. And then it kind of exposed this part of him who he always was. Like you said, these practices, they maybe only expose the practitioner. Maybe that's all that the practices do. But out of all the shows I've seen recently, that's one that just so speaks to the process of and maybe not even just the soul incarnating and then forgetting who it was before the incarnation and samsara and all that, but maybe just the person choosing the spiritual journey, or maybe just the person saying, maybe not even choosing the spiritual journey, maybe just daydreaming their way into a noticing that leads them to a synchronicity that leads them into realizing what they need to do with their life and finding their dharma.
Right. I think all those are pretty relevant. I mean, like the daydreaming thing reminds me of a literature class actually that I took in college on Moby Dick, basically. So all Melville writing. And I chose to write like this paper on reverie, the use of the word reverie throughout that text.
Could you define reverie for me?
So basically being in a state of
reverence, right?
Reverence, daydreaming, sort of like enticed by the normal, what is normally happening around you, that you also become unaware of it happening, of what's going on. So like a great example, I think this happens to almost everybody, is like when we're driving and we drive through like a stoplight and it's green, but we go through it and we're like, oh, did I just drive through like a red light? That's like reverie, right? That, I mean, I don't know if that happens to you. It happens to me sometimes.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
like you're driving and you're like, whoa, yeah. Then you think back and you're like, oh, and I guess like, people like, I believe it's Daniel Kahneman who talks about like type 1, type 2 thinking, or thinking fast, thinking slow, is sort of talking about that. But these writers and artists also have talked about these states of reverie, like sort of being in a different place, fully aware, but also unaware of in this case, in regards to Melville, danger, like the fact that this character is like constantly daydreaming in like the dangerous places ever on a whaling ship, right? And like why he does that. And so in some ways, I think we do that, like we do daydream in general, and it does take you away, but at the same time, it also influences, it can influence like where you are, right? I mean, that's essentially like what our not using that word because I'm not a big fan of using spirituality either, but using that methodology of, let's say, transmutation or transformation, it is like trying to capture those states of reverie and make them reflective, right? So I do think that's why I use the word longing, because I often feel that when someone starts a practice, and granted, most of my relationship with that is through yoga, but I have a lot of students who do other modes of, let's say, self-awareness, and often talk to me about how that integrates with their yoga practice, whether it's through like plant medicine or what have you, and how those integrations like can work together, and how they can also sometimes interfere with each other because just of the path that they are. Not that one's wrong or one's right, but it would be like even you and I, like working with the same student or client intensely, we might even have the same idea of where they're going, but both of us doing our work might create more of like a tug of war for that person who's going through that experience, and ultimately might leave them more confused, right? So it's like, even if it was like the same methodology, it can work in that way.
Too many chefs.
But yeah, exactly. So I think that's the idea of this longing is actually the individual wanting like a deep integration with the higher aspects of themselves, and sometimes even other aspects of themselves. So it's common for me personally as a yoga teacher, and you probably have heard me say this in my yoga teacher hat anyway, is that yoga doesn't necessarily like teach you or wake you up to the call that you're searching for, something deeper within yourself. That's already there, right? This is just a tool to get there, right? That calling or desire or longing, whatever we're trying to call it, it's there already. Even like people tend to talk always about Patanjali's second sutra in the first chapter, which is the idea that yoga is defined as somewhat of a mental cessation, so that your concentration is only absorbed into one thing. It doesn't say what that is, but most likely it's this idea of consciousness or God consciousness. But we often forget about the first sutra, which is essentially, now let's let yoga begin, or let's allow the yoga practice to unfold. And that one to me speaks even like a higher volume, because to me, it means that the individual has tried all these other methodologies, like either living life or doing whatever they're doing to try to get there, but those things haven't really worked to their satisfaction. So now they're electing, and that's the key word, is they're choosing to participate in this particular path or study. It's their choice. Whereas often I think when we use the words like spirituality, they're taught in a way where things are choiceless. Like we're like, well, Rocco, you don't know this thing, because, your energy is not flowing through to the right channels yet. When it does, you'll get there and you'll understand it.
Mhm.
Right. And I'm, me, I'm not really that's not my type of teaching. My type of teaching is like, you're already fully blossom blooming individual. And the inquiry is really just on the recognition of that through the methodology. The methodology allows you to recognize that, right? And potentially pull on this concept of reverie, like to take, where, like you said, like, where does this longing come from? Sometimes you make friends with it and you realize what you're actually longing for is not the thing that you have in your mind. It's something else.
Right. But that was
It's something you can take. You could taste it if you could put it on your tongue, but like it's not that.
right.
Yeah, and that's what and that's the tricky part. So I think that quality is like coming out, and these characters are like, I know there's this thing about me. I can almost taste it,
Right.
And you're right. Yeah, they did elect for it. They did elect for this procedure. Who knows why? I think this is where we get into humanity. If someone's like, well, I have a really, really great job for you. And you're totally like qualified to do it. But the only thing is we need to like, stick a probe in your brain so you can't remember what you're doing at work. Would you think that your person chose, this really awesome conscious job that contributes to society? Or is it like, you don't really, I don't remember if we know what they're actually doing.
Right. I think that was part of it. They were trying to figure that out too. Like, does
Yeah.
anybody know? Like maybe the other department knows. And there's this whole kind of conspiracy
Right.
mythology just within that floor of people who they don't know. Together, they don't know. So together they're
Yeah.
all curiously, yeah. That last soliloquy reverb reminded me of there's a yogic version of it, which I can't kind of grab right now. I know it's like something about types of cognition. So like valid cognition, invalid cognition, something memory, I forgot the terms or even what the point is of it. You kind of know what I'm pointing at there?
Sure.
The other thing that I do remember is I don't know if it's Jungian or where I stumbled upon it, but I remember I stumbled upon it in my early 20s. It was super helpful and never left because it was called the 4 stages of knowing. And it just always clicked. And there's the unknowingness. So you don't even know you don't know. Then there's the knowing unknowingness. So now you know that you didn't know. You're kind of like, oh shit. Which that is a stage probably lasts fluctuatingly long with the 2 middle ones, which the next stage is now you know. And then the final stage is you forget that you even know. So I would say that that's what we're kind of talking about with integration. And also the daydream. It's like,
right.
It's you're so in it that you don't even need to really be in it. That's actually the way that you're in it, which I know for me happens sometimes with art. Like, I think I need to listen to John Coltrane. Okay, cool. Listen to John Coltrane. I'm gonna light an incense. Oh man, that one guy, I think I need to get him back. Right. Okay, now back to this project, back to the project. Oh, that reminds me of this song that I was working on. Go to the song. So it's this kind of
Sure.
a meshing blend that the daydream is like a gust of wind that I've been super called to like Japanese like Zen flute jazz albums from 60s. And they have fire artwork too. There's a couple that I've just been like finding on YouTube, and let's see, I got one. And really, you can feel like, well, these guys are like rock stars playing the flute. But so like I'll play that, and then I'll play like another layer of sound, which like let's do jungle, forest, storm sounds, and then play this layer. And then for me, then I'll know what to do.
Right.
Or
I'm
from
not picking up on the audio, but
Oh, you can't hear the audio. Dang.
Yeah, but I can imagine
Oh, I'm
what it
playing.
might sound like
Oh, I see.
in my severed mind.
I wonder if it'll show up for the Zoom views. We'll see. But yeah, you create like a stack, and the
But I would
stack.
love to hear it. Yeah,
I can definitely. I'll send you a stack that I do sometimes.
cool.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, that was the kind of finale of that question. So the four stages of knowingness, that's what I call that.
Mhm.
But what is that yogic equivalent that I felt like I was pointing at something, valid cognition,
Yeah, so you get into like kleshas, and you also get into like aspects of avidya, right? Like how we see things, like in the sense of like through our ego, the I-ness, like, and that's like a lot to do with like control. And then again, back to the kleshas, like things like memory, how it can be harmful or helpful. There's like it's not necessarily like right or wrong, right? Like we look at these in layers, because even ego, like people don't realize, like usually when you first start doing yoga, it actually like enhances your ego. It makes you um uh more in the seat of like I am, that's kind of part of its process.
Hmm.
And as you develop that I am, and it gets into these Raja frameworks, that's when you actually start breaking down the ego, right?
Right.
You start to go through that transformation,
I,
or through that, the idea that, yeah, you might be able to manipulate experiences within your body, but the thing that you're experiencing is consciousness, and you don't really have control over that. The Upanishads look at it in another way, which is like, um, your effort can get you to where you're going to some degree, but consciousness has to push on you too, right? So, like, in order for you to enter that state, there has to be a good deal of allowing, not just effort, right? Effort would be defined as, the practice of any type of thing in which we're calling yogic, right? Whether it's asana or meditating. And we even tend to be polarizing on that. Well, that person just does asana. They don't really do yoga. That person just meditates. They don't really know anything about the physical body. And ideally, like, we want to have all of those things happening, but aspects of all of those things happen in everything that we do. So, for instance, like there's pranayama when you practice asana, and there's also steadiness when you practice asana. And usually, when you sit in a meditation, you're sitting in an asana or a mudra to do that anyway, right? So, like, there are other aspects of these things which we tend to think of are on the opposite spectrum, that exist within one another. So when we lose that, as you're talking about these stages of knowledge, that's when we actually find something interesting.
Hmm.
Like, it's in losing these things that we find something that's more revealing, right? But again, you're right. I do often look at these things pragmatically. It makes me think of like socialization. Like, we tend to hear people be like, oh, I have this child and I want them to socialize with other kids. It's really important for them. But if you look at socialization, like, it's actually important for children, yes, to socialize with kids their age, but it's equally as important for them to socialize with people who are not their age, because they learn things, like, for instance, from their grandparents that they're not going to learn from their parents, and that they're not going to learn from their older cousins or siblings, because these people have different levels of experience. And also, just like, let's not think about their experience, let's think about their mobility. Like, often, like, the way in which someone moves about in the world as an older person is different than a younger person,
Sure.
right? It's this, and how they might look at things are different. We might be in a rush to get someplace, and they might be the people who are like, oh, we should pull over and check out this thing,
Right.
or let's stop and have a snack. No, we don't need a snack now, we're just going to go. Like, so we tend to have these different ways of looking at the world. That's important to understand many different social people. And we see that played out over and over again, right? Like, the difference between generations and all this kind of stuff. Whereas, like, it's important to understand how those things are, in each person's uh, current identification, like where you are, right? And that they change. No one's a child forever.
Mhm.
So we're not always a seeker. sometimes we're actually fulfilled from the practice. So yeah, it's quite interesting. Sometimes you're so fulfilled you wish you were a seeker, because it was quite amazing to have all those novel experiences. Now you're kind of like, oh yeah, I can meditate, and it's great that you could do that, and it's shown, scientifically, that that's helpful, and you continue to, benefit your brain and the rest of your body. But the initial times that you get into those states are so like, wow, unbelievable.
Mm.
So I guess is another great gift of teaching, is that when you can see people get into those places, you're like, wow, yeah, totally. That's so cool, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Like, come hug me. I want that back.
Right,
So
right.
yeah, whatever it might be.
Like seeing someone's experience of love at first sight with that, call it the divine or whatever that internal experience is.
Yeah, I mean, it's all beautiful, really, like that idea of love at first sight, or, having that experience, and also like the heartbreak that comes from it. And, all those things are, fascinating things that we experience being human.
Yeah.
But, I think we tend to, because, our minds are all over the place, like long for things that we aren't currently experiencing.
Mm.
So yeah, it's why I also agree that spirituality is, kind of a weapon. It can be a weaponized word,
Yeah.
right? Like it's often directed at someone who doesn't have a level of what awareness or whatever we're trying to, sell, that someone else has. When I personally tend to look at it as like, these are tools which you can teach. They don't come from me, obviously. And you can teach people how to use them in a way that takes you someplace. But that ultimately, that experience is their experience. Like, I can't even tell them like that what they're experiencing is the same thing that I'm experiencing.
I don't get to
I
go
don't
with
know. Yeah, I don't get to go with you. Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. The five kleshas, I found this, I remember finding this little graphic. It was fun. Avidya is
Oh,
delusion, asmita, egoism, three, raga, which is not the same as raja or
yeah. As demands.
demands is raga, or attachment demands, like the ego's demands, meaning like attachment in that way.
Yeah, just to put it like pragmatically, it's like, oh, I would be so much more happy when I came home if, to your house, Rocco, being that, let's pretend we're roommates, if you had the dishes done.
Mm.
Like the fact that you didn't do the dishes, I can't be like happy now when I come home. So like, I'm seeing what we're seeing, and this is a really beneficial thing, because we tend to do that. We tend to look at other people and place levels of our emotional quality on how they are.
Right,
This is
right,
making a demand. Or we could say under the right conditions, under the right circumstances. If I wasn't in Malaysia and there wasn't like construction going on next door, I would be able to meditate for a longer period of time.
right.
Right. So we do make demands on sometimes things that, often these are things that are out of our control.
Right,
We
right.
try to regulate what those things are. And then, yeah.
Sometimes demands on others, sometimes demands on ourselves, sometimes demands on the environment.
Yeah. I mean, we can look at it quite simply, like, oh, I don't like going to Will's class because he doesn't let me do headstand in the first class. So I'm going to go to Rocco's class because he lets me do headstand right away. Like, now I'm actually like creating a scenario where I can have my own way on my spiritual journey to some degree. Right.
Right.
So I'm changing the pressure of the tonality of how I'm going to move through this thing. A lot of people might be thinking like, well, who cares? That doesn't really matter. But it does matter if the methodology of each of the teachers is specific enough to take you in a particular way. So this is when your drop-in yoga class is not really, it might not be taking you like through this aspect of a sadhana like thing. Like, it's taking you into like some type of transmutation or transformation. I'm not saying that can't happen in a class. Like, classes can definitely do that, but usually like it tends to be like a methodology of some sort, rather I can't just show up like at a, if I'm working with a shaman, I can't just show up and be like, yeah, I've done this stuff before, just give it to me. This is, I didn't follow your diet, I didn't do any of the preparation, I'm just ready to roll. Let's do this. Usually, like, there are things in which you have to do. A lot of it, rightfully so, is honoring, the tradition and the actual vehicle in which you're using. But what we tend to find is, people, as things become more accessible, you'll see that people will not be as honorable towards those things. Look at like the yoga world. Now we just want a class that's accessible, it's affordable, and we can get to it whenever we'd like to get to it. But a lot of people don't really talk about like, oh, I want to go the distance. I want to like actually like peer into these things that we call yoga or we talk about as being yoga. But I'm not necessarily getting like in my everyday yoga class, partially because that's not what yoga classes tend to be about. Or sometimes that teachers don't really know what those things are, but they teach all the other things, or that there's not room to teach those things in a yoga studio. Those are usually the scenarios that you see, right? Is that usually you're catering to the audience. And when you start doing that, you run into an issue. Like I remember when yoga, not to get on yoga alliances, like, cause a problem with yoga alliance or anything like that. But like they came up with this thing, which I think is quite interesting. It's sort of like everything is now rated, right? This was a while ago and people were super psyched about this. Yeah, you can get 5-star rating, you can get this type of rating, but like, let's just think about this like logically for a moment. You're having someone who doesn't know about yoga, which is why they're taking, let's say, a training program, and then they're going to rate the training program. So what are they rating it on?
Right.
Just user ability. That's it. It doesn't really it doesn't really acknowledge like the real depth of the program. It doesn't acknowledge like the conditions of the program, really, just that it was suitable for their needs of going through something. I mean, like most of us will look at these things too. It's like TripAdvisor. We look at someone going somewhere, you look at it, it's like, this place is terrible. It doesn't have air conditioning. And then you look at what the place is, and it's like an eco jungle retreat. Of course, it doesn't have air conditioning. That's not the point of it. The point of it is that it shouldn't have air conditioning. It should blend in with nature, right? Like that's what it is. So how can you get that person who doesn't like air conditioning to, favor this thing? So I think the measurement system is a little odd. Like we run into stuff like that.
Right.
It's possible we don't know what time it is in this severance. We don't really know, like, is it now? Right. Is it like a little bit in the future? Right. Is it in the past? It looks modern, it looks current. It looks like
current. It looks like it felt like recent, but maybe not completely up to date. Like almost reminded me of like the 90s or early 2000s in like the Midwest is what it reminded me. Like the snow, and I don't know if I remember seeing modern cars, but whatever the context is. Well, I want to get you out of here on a regular scheduled program. The other ones were Divesa, which is repulsion, Abhinvesa, repulsion. So 2 different types of repulsion, Abhinvesa and Divesa. And the
yeah, usually those are like kind of like lumped together in some way. Like we often like look at them like as aversion, like right, where we push or reject something based on whatever, I didn't want to do that anyway, and we move away from it in that way. So that's how it's like commonly taught. But yeah, there are different types of repulsions and these coverings, they sort of like stop us from seeing things clearly. And it's our own modus operandi. It's like how we're looking at things and how those things change. Which is, I guess we could, if we wanted to simplify this idea of severance, we could say that at a particular point in time, said individual decided that it was a good idea to sever their mind frame from work and life based on whatever was happening at the time. And that with a relative short period of time, who knows how long they've been working there, let's say it's even a year, then this longing starts to occur that they want to actually know this other part of their life again, because people change. Like, we're constantly changing, you know. We might have this conversation like, you know, 6 months from now and think, yeah, whatever, it wasn't really that important. We'll probably think the show might still be cool, the concept is cool, but maybe it doesn't have like such a huge impact on our lives. We're like, yeah, that's pretty normal. I mean, right? We think it's pretty normal. And we're like, yeah, I guess a shoe isn't a shoe. We could actually pretend it's a telephone, or drink out of it, or sail it down the river, or whatever, right? Like, it could be a sign. You know, tie the laces together and throw it on a wire. It's become something different. Yeah.
Well, to the sake of pragmatism and utility, there's a new show that maybe, unless you already heard of it, maybe I'll be recommending it to you. It's called Beef. You heard of it?
I have heard of it. Yeah.
You've seen it?
Seen a bit of it. Yeah.
I'm only on episode number 2 and very much enjoying what I'm seeing. And maybe there's another conversation at the other side of this show for us about some of the through line, which is like, if it is utility and consciousness, being able to be conscious of your response specifically to the pull of the social dimension, and how many of us get pulled and miscued, and call it energy drainages, or call it rabbit holes, or call it distractions, or call it, you know, waste of time or energy. Maybe there's a lesson in it, and that's okay, cool. But you can shorten that lesson by learning from it that, you know, okay, this is a bad jumble of juju beans. Let's not get involved. But specifically that domain, that dimension of the social realm, and these different kleshas and what they point to, you know, whatever, the spiritual journey is only relevant for the ego mind that doesn't know about the spiritual realm, but to the spiritualized essence, or, you know, the one who remembered and the one who is now forgot that they remembered, and they're integrated, then yeah, the word spirituality is nonsense. But to somebody who's so caught up into that, you know, that world of reactivity and very, very little free will to participate, because it's constantly pinball machining their sense organs into response, you know, actively, and yet draining and not fulfilled. I just see the beginnings of that. Somebody from a wealthy, somebody from a not so wealthy, but both peeling towards some type of obviously dysfunctional attempt at like retribution, and like, is it satisfactory what you're clawing at? And maybe they wouldn't be able to even describe it as so.
Yeah, no, I think that's interesting concept. I think, but you know, often I find that when we get it, and this is why I think both of us sort of agree on this idea of, you know, spirituality sort of being like a weaponized word, is that we tend to like associate the things that go along with it also with acceptable aspects, and a lot of times they're social, of what a conditioned spiritual person does. So like, for instance, like a spiritually sound person is not going to cut someone else off in their car, like in this series Beef that you're saying, and then flip them off and go into a whole road rage incident, right? Like, that's not going to happen, because they have reprogrammed themselves to be, you know, empathetic, understanding, and all the other qualities, right? Or is it that all of that stuff is actually just nonsense, because, you know, human beings have human reactions and responses, and one of those responses, sure, is understanding and empathy and all these particular things, but one of them might be like trying to chase you down in my car, you know, and can those things exist simultaneously? I always find interesting. It's like, can those things exist simultaneously? What does it actually look like? I mean, I tend to think that we we project that ideology a lot of times on our, political figures. We tend to project this idea of altruism, or, doing right, doing well, or whatever it is. And then we see them behave in a particular way, but we continue to allow them to behave in a particular way. So it's quite interesting. But one thing that you said that I definitely feel a little bit more conviction towards, and these are just more questions I'm throwing out there with what I just said, but more what I feel more conviction towards is that you can't change people to become or behave in the way in which you think they should. I'm not a big supporter of that, like that you can transform anyone and that anyone can be transformed and that you should try to transform them, right? So to me, I don't think that those things are so important. So if someone is, for instance, that is how they're continually reacting and moving through, and life is a series of reactions, and it takes them on to this road rage incident, as we're seeing in the series that you mentioned. And it does get deeper, like the series does get deeper, which is quite interesting. But I do think there is a nature of certain people that is like not always changeable. I don't know if it's like where it came like in trend for spirituality to be about changing someone rather than sort of showing them a possible route or path to clarity. But usually it does require that person to, again, have that concept which we're using, which is longing. They have a desire to want this thing, and then therefore that creates an openness within their mind frame. Now, that being said, do I think that it's possible for anyone to change? Absolutely, because I'm an optimist. I think that anyone can change. Yeah, I think it's absolutely possible. I believe in potentiality.
Yeah.
But I don't think it's my job or anyone else's job to change everybody. Right.
Which is why I feel like you have the obvious thumbprint of the spiritual journey on your electromagnetic signature. You're someone who has been transformed to some degree to understand some level of the processes that are occurring that would drive anybody to make any choice that maybe would, if it offended you, you're able to perceive, I mean, from my recognition, and yeah, also from self-recognition, what has changed? Well, there's a sensitivity that has progressed into a deepening of an ability to understand. And then in that ability to understand, there's been a lessening to my imprisonment to reactivity or uncontrollable reaction to things that specifically, just for this reference at least, have to deal with the attempt to control other people. And that dimension of social, and this word maybe is the key, social tribal identities that are so reactive uncontrollably, just on like a very primitive sense of archetype. And that's all that I'm referencing about the beef show. It's like, oh, she's this, and the ego projection mapping from this ego, which is this, this mask with this set of identities, that's then seeing this other ego mask, and it's got all of these identities, and these identities are just like ping-ponging, and the souls are on the, right on the other side of the mask, that at some point someone could have some type of cathartic thing that goes, and they have this moment of like, oh shit, now I'm back. Wait a minute, what was that? And that for me was what the first time I heard Alan Watts say a Satori moment. He's like, that's just Satori. It's not the full thing. And don't get Satori confused with the I think he said something about it's like the difference between the tourist and the resident. There's the person who's just kind of they're just a tourist for the spiritual journey, and they might glimpse it, and then they take that glimpse and they go back to their regular social tribal life, and they say, I've had spiritual experience, everyone. So now, and their mask adjusts,
Sure.
To the person who has had, 57,000 of those, and they become Ram Dass, and they're like,
right.
That to me is a different, and it's measurable, that
Sure.
maybe we continue talking. But I want to give you the opportunity on this outro to maybe say a little bit about this upcoming retreat, digital retreat that you got, right?
Oh yeah, appreciate that.
Yeah.
So essentially the two to three like things that I sort of hybridized and pre-COVID is teacher training programs, which Rocco has also been part of. So this is like a retreat, like a small version of two of the training programs that I initially started, Hot the Video with actually. And they've been going strong for, I guess, the last 20 years. So this is just a quick little drop in. You learn sadhana. We go through lectures that, open up scriptural studies that support the sadhana. So a big thing with my teachings overall is like, I like the student to be able to have the techniques to practice the tools to get there. But I also like to have them know the origin source of the teachings through scriptural study. And then for us to have time to talk about those things so they can actually like go through their integration process in a group of people who are going through the same thing. And then post retreat, like usually a couple of weeks later, I'll do a follow-up session just to see how that progress is going with everyone. So that's a bit about the retreat. But yeah, you could just find that on my website, Duprey, duprey.com. But yeah, cool. Appreciate that.
Yeah, cool. Thank you. That's end of this month, April, yeah? 28, 29, 30?
Yeah, coming up next week. So yeah.
Fun. Awesome.
Yep.
Well,
We should talk. I like what you left with. I think we should talk about this is maybe like something for you to look into is like the Simmelian idea of a stranger. So it's Simmel, Simmel.
okay.
And he has this paper. I can send it to you. It's pretty interesting. The concept of a stranger. It came to mind when you're talking about Alan Watts's idea of a tourist and someone who sort of resides there. Because he does touch upon those things like this idea of what a stranger is. And I look at it also like in terms of concepts, like for instance, trying something new that you've never heard of is a strange concept to you, but you might find like 2 years from now you're doing it all the time, so there's no longer strangeness involved in that, right? So it's quite interesting, but I think you would like that
Yeah.
philosophical framework is quite interesting.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I'll dive in.
Yeah.
That'll be our next talk, maybe.
Sounds good. Sounds like a plan.
Thank you, brother.
Always a pleasure, my friend.
Always a pleasure. Have fun, enjoy, and I'm sure we'll talk soon.
Sounds good.
And for everybody out there, check out Severance and maybe Beef, because maybe that's what we talk about next, and Similian Stranger.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I would love to like keep that chat going, for sure. It's quite an interesting one.
Yeah, beautiful.
So all right. Easy.